Calling all film fanatics and culture lovers, it's showtime. Cultures and Communities Fest is coming soon, both virtually and in person, to a movie palace near you. CCF features a full week of candid conversations, moving pictures, and unforgettable events, all focused on holistic health and social wellness. Come celebrate culture with your community this September 6th through the 12th. Go to mkefilm.org/CCF for more information.
Well, thank you all for joining us. My name is Molly Vey, and my pronouns are she, they, and I am the Artist Services Manager here at Milwaukee Film. So I do anything and everything related to filmmakers. And on that lovely note, I have an incredible filmmaker here with us tonight. Vivian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Vivian Kleinman, and I'm the director of the documentary film No Straight Lines, The Rise of Queer Comics. And I'm delighted to be invited to participate both in the festival and in this discussion with you, Molly.
Awesome. I am very excited. Our genre queer programmer, Aster, knew that I am a huge comic book fan. And I have gone on many a rant to them about my love of Alison Bechdel. So I was excited to watch your film a couple of different times and to speak with you. And I would love to just hear from you how you came to the subject matter and how you started the making of this film.
Yeah, well, it's actually a fun story. I was approached by a friend and colleague, Greg Sirotto, who had started the idea of a film on queer comic book artists, and with a friend of his, Justin Hall, who's an expert in the subject. And they asked me to get involved, and they encouraged me to attend the world's first international ingathering of queer comic book artists that took place in 2015 in New York. And I went. I was kind of curious, but to be honest, while I was wildly a fan of Alison Bechdel's series, Dykes to Watch Out For, I hadn't really followed the scene very much. When I walked into the conference hall that first morning, I was completely astonished by what I saw. There was, in the middle of the space, the gathering space, was a young person with chartreuse-colored hair standing and talking very intently with an elderly gentleman with a button-down white-collared shirt, balding hair, pot belly. And around them were all kinds of, the whole spectrum of queer life, everybody like involved and connected and throwing zines and buttons and pins at one another. And it just felt like this incredible connection. It felt like, oh, this is quite contrary to the stereotype of the curmudgeonly artists, especially the underground comic scene of Robert Crumb and those kinds of folks. And I thought, there's something very special going on here. By the end of the 2-day conference, and I had a chance to listen to all these incredible presentations and discussions and hear all these stories and get to meet more people, I knew that it was a world that I was not familiar with and a world that I wanted others to become familiar with, really to give voice to a whole different way of thinking about what it means to be queer.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So how did you go about that research process, especially coming at it with the expansiveness that your film shows of the queer comic book scene and the history of it? Like, how did you begin that process?
Right. Well, the operative word is what you just used, expansiveness. And one can get encyclopedic if you want to start telling this, the history of 4 decades of queer comic books. There's a lot of people and a lot of images and a lot of material. And so for me as a filmmaker, my interest is less in being comprehensive and more about giving the viewer an emotional experience, a narrative arc that will give them a little insight into a world that they knew nothing about before. And so my approach is to narrow it down. And my instinct was to select a few artists whose stories we could profile, whose personal stories would be profiled as a way to use the microcosm, the detail of individual lives and the pioneers in this field, and use that as a way to express bigger issues like, who gets to tell our stories and what does it mean to have self-representation in this field that involves an art genre that involves both words and images. So that's really the launching pad for my starting this project.
I love that. Yeah. And I think, you touched on something that I think is really compelling of how do we take static images in these stories and really bring them to life. And can you talk about the process of like actually putting these people and their stories and also the work that they did into a film and that kind of translating of media, I guess?
Well, one of the joys of picking this subject is that not only was that ingathering of queer comic book artists inspiring, but because of the intergenerational and the intersectionality of the people working in the field, but they're just great storytellers and they're just really great people. So picking great storytellers was the easy part. Narrowing it down to 5 people to profile was a harder challenge. Like, how do you pick the best when there's so many bests or most significant of artists? And but once I went through that process with Justin, who I said is the expert in the subject, and I sat when we did a first assembly of the film, having finished filming all 5 people, I looked at the material and I thought, oh, this feels kind of static. And I wanted to infuse it with more vitality and more of a sense of, I wanted the film itself, the filmmaking itself, embody the content. And so I tried to infuse, I went on this journey to try to infuse the film itself with the spirit and with the visual vocabulary, as it were, of queer comics. And that led us down to a path that resulted in, I think, playing with images, playing with presentation of people in the frame that kind of echoes a comic book page, that kind of stuff. And then I also did another thing too. We also, I should say, had a wonderful animator, Suzanne Slatcher, who's a former Pixar artist, who did just a little bit of animation on the static comics. We didn't want to go goofy and convert it from still to animation per se.
Sure.
But I did. But when you do see one static comic after another, it's on a film. It's different than when you're turning the page yourself and doing it at your own pace. But we did want to have a little bit of more visual stuff going on, and that was a lot of fun.
Like all of the best parts of a good comic and a good story kind of coming together in this really beautiful medium that is film that we all love. So no, I think that's really fantastic. And I loved that. Something that I thought was really interesting when I started the film the first time, it's the rise of queer comics. And so it made sense how much of it was the history and the incredible richness of that. But can you talk about this? You interwove so many contemporary artists and watched that transition happen. And so can you talk about just like finding and sourcing all of these incredible people and showing their work and what that experience was like for you as a maker?
Right. Well, I said that in response to the first assembly, I kind of was invigorated to think differently about how to approach the film. And it was after the first rough cut that I had that same kind of reaction, which was, oh, this still needs another layer of filmic element to braid through these 5 personal stories. I had always been opposed to making it a contemporary story. I wanted to narrow down the focus because already, as I said, 4 decades is a hell of a lot of material to cover.
And you picked very prolific people too. Like they have a lot of work to go through.
Gosh darn it. But then you have the question, well, what's bringing it up to date? Because this is a film that's going to have a very long shelf life. It's not just a news feature that's on Tuesday night at 6 and then it's gone. This will be seen by people 20 years from now, maybe even 30 years from now or more. So the word bring it up to date, if you think about it, isn't as relevant for a documentary film as it might be for some other projects. But when I looked at the first rough cut, and it felt, and I had the five people, I had the stories of five artists interwoven, I thought, what would make it relevant? What would make it feel more relevant? What would motivate a young person to want to care to enter this world? And what would be the welcome mat to bring them into this film? And I thought, perhaps voices of young people like the people I'm trying to reach. And so at a following conference, like I said, there was the Queers and Comics conference in 2015 in New York. There was another one in San Francisco 2 years later. And at that one, I took advantage of this ingathering to select at random about a dozen young artists. And I put them in front of a white screen to have them be offset from the way the five pioneers were filmed. And I just started talking with them. I didn't know their work. I didn't know anything about them. I had literally 10 minutes from start to finish. I had an assistant who was clocking the 10 minutes. And we just made do with what we could. And out came these amazing stories. And I knew at once that this was going to be, I didn't quite know exactly how I would use these young voices. And it took a long time in the editing process to find a way that made it feel integrated, made it feel like not just an added, barnacle, but part of the story. And to be honest, when I would ask, when I did like little trials to see how it was working, it took a long time of repositioning till finally, like Legos, until we finally found a structure where the viewer felt like, oh, this is a story that flows together. And yes, we have many different elements that we're braiding together. We have the comics, we have the stories of the five pioneers, we have little, what I call the Greek chorus, voices from younger people speaking about the impact of the five pioneer artists on their work. We have the comics themselves, and we have the animation, the animation. So there was a lot. The main challenge in the editing was to braid all those different elements in a way that would feel like it made sense, that it wasn't confusing, and that it felt like it was they all were working in service of advancing the story and the viewer's appreciation of the story as it advanced.
I love that. They also gave you a lot of material to work with in 10 minutes. I loved, the continuity of it. I think that's something that's really important, of recognizing like who came before and who is still making incredible work, and how you can pull from that and also make it your own. I just thought that was a really lovely element. So it worked quite well for me, at least.
Yeah, I want to add that for me, I was quite touched by their comments because, a lot of us like to be very proud of our original ideas and the newness of what we are bringing to our artwork. And yet here is a generation of people who are very comfortable acknowledging the continuum. And I thought that was really quite touching.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think, something that I feel like a theme that really came out in the film, and I would love to hear your perspective as an artist yourself about that role of the arts in representing humans in their fullness and in all of the bits. And I feel like your pioneers really touched on that, but if there was anything that you wanted to add in terms of what making this film meant to you, to your audience, and what you hope people really take from that.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear that part of why I got involved in this subject, apart from the fact that I saw some really cool people and heard some really great stories, but I wanted to create a film that I wished I had when I was coming out, when I was a young person and struggling. And, a lot of us like to think that the struggle is over, that we have gay rights in this area, we have, gay marriage, We have queer representation on, broadcast television, at Netflix, and yet represent the percentage of young people who are attempting suicide, queer youth,
Yeah.
the percentage of queer youth attempting suicide by far is disproportionate to the general population. And
Yeah.
that statistic just blinds me. And it tells me that our youth still need stories and still need encouragement to make it through the rough times that they're facing, whether it's rejection from their families or rejection from their peers. So for me, both filmmaking and comics are vehicles to help shape perceptions of self and to help give voice to perceptions of self. So that kind of works in two directions, to mirror and to help shape at the same time. And I just love that about the creative outpouring that we do. And I think it's our work requires an audience for it to be complete. It's kind of like the viewer has final cut and the reader has the final word in the narrative of the comics. Because after all, the history of queer comics is less about superheroes and more about the true stories of representing our own lives with humor and with poignant insight and commentary. It ranges from a bad hair day to, the AIDS crisis and looking for love and lost love, but also about coming out to one's family and feeling the burden of the crisis that it creates in our families, and the torture and the torment. So it's a very complicated dynamic.
Yeah. No, I love that, the mirror and the shaping, because I feel like that's something that feels very important to me as like for my artistic practice. And I feel like I saw that in your film with your pioneers and with this emerging generation of makers saying like, we're looking at what came before and we're also taking that and really trying to push forward and push through that, and how much we wish we had seen before now and how grateful we are for what we did see.
Speaking of legacies, by the way, I should give a nod to somebody who influenced me. I was considered his mentor, but Marlon Riggs, who was well known for the landmark film Tongues Untied, that I was involved with. I collaborated with Marlon on a documentary called Color Adjustment, which is a history of how primetime television represented African Americans. And I feel like, and that it was in that project that Marlon gave me the language of how images, how pop culture in particular, both help shape and mirror our perceptions of ourselves and of the world around us. So a little nod to Marlon in this.
I love it. Always have to acknowledge those who came, right? And who did it and who taught it, and the grace of that, of giving knowledge to the next crew. Just I think my last question that I have for you is, was there something in making this that really stuck with you? Something that surprised you, something you learned, something that was exciting or frustrating, anything like that, but something that really stuck with you from this project?
Well, I'm going to respond with a very simple comment, which is one of the person who did the person who was the first out lesbian and queer person to do a queer comic was Mary Wings, one of our 5 pioneers of queer comics in the film. And when she talks about just like sitting down and deciding, to tell her story of what it really was like to be a lesbian, and not knowing who was going to read it, not knowing if it was going to jeopardize her professional career as a teacher, because at the time there was an assumption that, or I should say a stereotype, that gay people were pedophiles. And she literally would have lost her job. She could have lost her job as a teacher for doing that comic. Her courage, her bravery to do it without knowing its impact, the personal price that she would pay, to not know the personal price that you're going to pay for taking action of telling your own story and representing yourself. That courage and that bravery is really, for me, the essence of the film. And I hope that that's the lingering understanding of the meaning of the film.
Yeah, the boldness and the authenticity and I love it. The beauty
And that
of
is for
telling their
each
story.
generation to reinvent themselves and to reinvent representations of self. And that's an ongoing process, a continual ongoing process that I'm sure will continue for a few more generations.
Hopefully a little bit easier every generation.
Yes.
I don't know, but that's the hope. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and for making this film and really diving into these people and their work and sharing your work with us. I just wanted to thank you for that. It was really lovely.
Well, it goes both ways, because without the film festivals, filmmakers would not be reaching our audiences so easily. You are really the stepping stone between the filmmaker and the filmmaking process and our audience. So thank you so much for all the sweat and hard work that you guys are doing. I know it's a labor of love and passion, and I'm very grateful for it.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, have a really lovely rest of your day. And thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to our Q&A this afternoon. You can check out the film on our website, watch.mkufilm.org, and have a really lovely rest of your day.